Hello.
Hello.
Hello,
Hello,
my name is Emily,
my name is Liz.
My name is Eric.
My name is Avery.
and we are all students at the University of Victoria.
As students who learn at the university,
We would like to respectfully acknowledge
The university sits on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen and Wasanish nations.
Known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations.
this is their land and we are uninvited guests on it.
we are here to discuss the calls for justice for all Canadians that are outlined in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry Report.
Specifically, we are discussing Call 15.5.
Confront and speak out against racism
Sexism, ignorance, homophobia, and transphobia.
and teach or encourage others to do the same.
Wherever it occurs, in your home, in your workplace, or in a social setting.
When discussing the violence that Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA+ people face, it is important to understand where the violence comes from and what perpetrates it.
There are 4 distinct pathways which perpetrate and maintain colonial violence,
which are number 1, historical, multi-generational trauma and intergenerational trauma.
2. Social and economic marginalization.
3. Maintaining the status quo and institutional lack of will. And 4.
and ignoring the agency and expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people.
As the National Inquiry Report points out,
Colonial violence, as well as racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia against Indigenous women and girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people has become embedded in everyday life.
This is why it is so vital to actively confront and speak out whenever and wherever ignorance occurs.
the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry Report demonstrates the reality that ignorance surrounding Indigenous peoples, tradition, culture, histories, and issues is present in the minds of all settler Canadians. In order to fight the ignorance that perpetuates colonial violence, settler Canadians must understand the importance of educating themselves and others by listening to Indigenous peoples and learning from them. This process of unlearning and relearning is a lifelong commitment, but by better educating future generations of settler Canadians, the hope is that the ignorance surrounding the violence that Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people face diminishes. Today's current public school system's curriculum regarding Indigenous histories and issues is extremely limited at best, and the little information that children do get taught depicts a false reality that we are now living in a time where racism against Indigenous people is in the past. However, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Report brings to light how much racism still exists in modern-day Canada. It has been woven into the very fabric of Canadian society since the point of contact, starting with the doctrines of colonialism that modern-day Canada is built on. The report points out that both institutional and individual racism against Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people is at the heart of the colonial structures and represents a core cause for the violence that they face. The National Inquiry grounds racism throughout its whole analysis, showing how it perpetuates violence that is killing Indigenous women and girls. Racism and colonialism are systems that work with one another, so in order to work towards dismantling the colonial violence that targets Indigenous women and girls, settler Canadians must confront the racism wherever and whenever it occurs. In order to do this, it is vital that all settler Canadians educate themselves and others so that they may recognize the reality that racism is present in all colonial structures, as well in the very colonial mindset of settler Canadians. We are long past a time where simply not knowing that what you are doing or participating in is racist.
Indigenous women and girls are no strangers to discrimination. They're the hearts of their communities, and they face a double burden which places them under discrimination and scrutiny due to their Indigenous identity and their gender identity. In order to understand this discrimination, we must acknowledge the differences between Indigenous cultures and settlers in order to really understand the impact and the hierarchy that colonialism has and the pathways that maintain it. First, we have to look at Indigenous women and girls in a historical colonial context. When colonizers first arrived, they brought their patriarchal laws and ideals, which distorted the balance between Indigenous men and women that had existed for hundreds of years. Their roles together were complementary, never competitive. Colonial beliefs held on to patriarchal values that harmed Indigenous women and girls by invalidating their sacred knowledge. First Nation women had a lengthy knowledge of health and medicine practices, but the church, invalidated this into sorcery or witchcraft. Early Christian views held on to the Bible as an absolute truth, which made it difficult for Indigenous women and girls to express their true culture and identities because it was so oppressive and contradictive. It was a known goal that the church wanted to Christianize Indigenous people. Not only that, but Indigenous women and girls were expected to adhere to a gender binary that was completely contradictive to their own culture and values. For example, the Indian Act placed Indigenous women's status on their husbands, where they could no longer claim their own indigeneity. The Indian Act also allowed Indian agents to police and control Indigenous women and girls by shaming promiscuity or anything deemed to be sexual misbehavior. Not only were women not allowed to gain status, vote, or own land on their own, but they also had no spiritual or sexual liberties.
Violence is the marginalization and discrimination of Indigenous women, girls, and SLGBTQQIA people of the health and natural sexuality just because it happens to be opposing of the strict sexual norms imposed by colonization. When colonial missionaries began with force to remove Indigenous children from the communities and families into residential schools, a regime of Christian ideas and faith denied Indigenous children the sexual freedom to explore their natural curiosity. Formerly before settlers arrived at Turtle Island, Indigenous communities respected the coming-of-age experience of growing into one's sexual identity because they understood the relationship between health of the individual and the health of the community. With great sorrow, it is true that many young Indigenous girls experience various forms of abuse while at the residential schools. With the National Inquiry report unpacking the truths of the Indigenous women who at the time were still young girls, there was a clear consensus that the homophobia and association of same-sex relationships with deviance and abuse was a result of those times. Homophobia is prevalent today within and outside of Indigenous communities. Confronting and speaking out against homophobia begins with listening and acknowledging the truths of survivors of colonial systems of oppression, who experience violence directly through such systems such as the residential schools, or indirectly through the endurance of trauma. Being conscious of the language and conversation about homosexuality within your home, workplace, and social setting will allow you to come prepared to inform others about Canada's colonialism, and allow yourself to reflect on your actions that restrict an expansive appreciation for all expressions of indigeneity, sexuality, and gender.
Transphobic attitudes, words, and actions can contribute to genuine harm toward Indigenous trans people. For example, one of the MMIWG final report's witnesses was an Indigenous trans woman who talked about the fact that she had to endure racist and transphobic comments from other tenants in order to access affordable housing. More broadly, many trans and other queer Indigenous people leave their communities due to transphobia and lack of safety. Because of his contribution to situations like these, it's especially important to call out transphobia and encourage more respectful and informed attitudes towards trans people. However, what specific attitudes and behaviors should be called out? The most obvious is deliberate misgendering, which the final report describes as a form of severe psychological violence and emotional abuse. Beliefs that trans people are not really their identified gender, are unnatural or unworthy of respect need to be called out, as does the myth that being trans is a mental illness. Additionally, two-spirit identities and Indigenous gender diversity have been suppressed by colonial norms that deny the existence of genders beyond male and female. Given this fact, respecting two-spirit identity and the roles they hold in different cultures is an important part of allyship with Indigenous trans and gender diverse people. In order to call out ignorance, homophobia, sexism, transphobia, and racism, we have to recognize when and where you can see them.
At school, it could be shutting down offensive jokes and asking your friends why did they think that. At home, it could be more difficult because speaking against your loved ones or family can be hard and even dangerous at times.
If it is safe and you find that your loved ones are committing hate acts or speech, try asking them where they learned that information or how long ago.
If it seems to turn into a diplomatic and fair discussion, then simply explaining the 4 pathways which maintain violence could change a person's mindset.
Having discussions which reveal violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people are critical and necessary for creating change and should be had whenever it is beneficial and nonviolent.
The Indigenous Ally Toolkit says that being an ally is about disrupting oppressive spaces by educating others on the realities and histories of marginalized people.
This means calling out hate speech or acts and speaking up if someone is being ignorant, even if it is uncomfortable.
The point of being an ally is to recognize the space you take in this Indigenous land, and where your privileges places you in colonial structures.
As an ally, it is crucial to recognize that the conversation is not about you.
Lastly, we would like to sign off with a quote from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Executive Summary that distinguishes the importance of familiarizing yourself with all calls to justice.
All calls to justice are aimed at ending genocide, tackling root causes of violence, and improving quality of life for Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people. This is the only way forward. Thank you.